one of the exotics vets, like the boarded zoo veterinarians, walked in and was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" We're like, "Oh, we're did a necropsy on this chameleon." He's like, "I don't know why you're even bothering doing the necropsy. It's kidney failure. It's always kidney failure." And just kind of like walked out. But the biggest screw up that I made, and I discussed in my very first video, like, I'm going to do a cleanup crew. There's no information online about what kind of cleanup crew to use, so I'm just going to throw all of the things and see what sticks. That was not a good idea. And it was not a good idea because what will make this one unique, because it's still going to have a ledge for climbing, and I'll put branches in and whatnot. It'll still be bioactive and have plants, but what makes this one really unique is it has an integrated rack tray in it. I bought one of the old school ball python rack trays that
Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Connor Long, who is a veterinarian out of California and a longtime reptile keeper. In this episode, Dr. Long talks about how going through vet school has altered his own practice of herpetoculture. We also discuss what one of the main reasons for death of reptiles in captivity is. Connor also walks us through an incredible bioactive arid enclosure that he set up for his leopard gecko, and he walks us through how he did it, what are some of the successful things he's done, and some of the areas that he would definitely change in the future, including the cleanup crew, which has got a little bit chaotic on him at the moment. So we walk through some of the mistakes that he's made and sort of the things that he would change when he redoes it again in the future. And we also discuss his 25-year-old ball python, and we specifically discuss its second to last enclosure that it was in, which was a large, well-planted bioactive enclosure, but unfortunately it had an equipment failure, which led to the snake becoming ill. So Connor talks about how he noticed the snake was ill, what he did, what steps he took to make sure he could bring that snake back to thriving health, which is pretty incredible at 25 years old. And then he discusses a really interesting, unique new build that he's doing to make sure that equipment failure doesn't happen again, and that the snake is in a safer environment. So he has this really interesting new enclosure design. He's not the first person to come up with this design, but I don't see this design often enough, and I think it's going to be something that should be used more often. So we discuss that, and he talks about how he built that and whatnot. And I really enjoyed this conversation. It is a very thorough discussion, and I know you will all enjoy it as well. Before we jump into it, if you are looking for more information on the podcast or any other episode, make sure you head to animalsathome.network.com. You can also join us on Patreon at patreon.com/animalsathome. Thank you very much to CustomReptileHabitats.com for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. If you're looking for any reptile-related equipment, make sure you head to the affiliate links in both the YouTube description or the show notes. That is an affiliate link, so if you do make a purchase, a small commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you, and of course that helps me produce the show. All right, let's jump into this conversation with Dr. Connor Long. Enjoy. Well, Dr. Long, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dylan.
You've been on my list for a long time, probably almost a year, actually. I think somebody had sent me, one of my patrons had sent me your leopard gecko arid setup about a year ago, originally. Did you post it about a year ago on YouTube? I think so, right?
Yeah, probably September 2020, I think, maybe November. Yeah. I don't remember exactly when I finished it. I've been working on that enclosure for a very long time with one of my COVID projects.
Yeah, so it all blends together.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was one video that really stood out. So I've had you on my list for a while. So I'm glad that we're able to do this. And why don't we give you a little bit of background, how you got interested in animals and exotics in the first place, and maybe a little bit of your education and career path.
Yeah, sure. So, as long as I can remember, I've been really interested in reptiles. And I was thinking about that recently, actually. And I think it's because reptiles and amphibians, when you're a kid interested in wildlife, they're one of the animals that's more quote unquote kind of accessible to you. Like, people go out and go bird watching, but you need a lot of equipment for bird watching, and I didn't have any of that as a kid. And then, I would love to go watch like wolves or cougars or something, but that's not something that you can really do. They're up in the middle of the night. Nobody ever sees them, right? And reptiles and amphibians, they're everywhere. And growing up, my grandparents had a farm, and they had tons of like garter snakes and salamanders and frogs out there. And I'd go look at those and catch them when I was a kid. And so when I got a little bit older, I started keeping reptiles and amphibians. And I got my first pet reptile when I was 7, which is my ball python that I still have. And that was actually a bribe from my parents to make it so I wouldn't quit playing Pee Wee soccer, because I hated Pee Wee soccer. And they're like, well, okay, we'll get you a snake if you just like tough it out.
That's a great deal.
So yeah. And I mean, it worked. I think I did two years of that, and I was like, no more.
Yeah.
But shortly thereafter, I got some. I started keeping leopard geckos too, and I was breeding those by the time I was like 8 or 9. And I always wanted a chameleon, but the more I kind of learned about chameleons when I was a kid, the more I was like, there's no way I can take care of these. So in a lot of ways, it's been like a 20-year journey to gaining enough competence to be able to successfully keep that chameleon when I was 8. Mm-hmm. And then I went to the University of California at Santa Barbara for college, and I majored in biology. I did take their herpetology classes. They only have 2 herpetology classes, and they have a third that like is tangentially related to herpetology. And I sort of switched gears and studied cell biology for a while. Or I had a general Bachelor of Science in Biology, but I was kind of focused on the cell bio aspect of it. And after graduation, I realized I don't really know what I want to do. I was thinking maybe med school. When I was a kid, I'd wanted to be a veterinarian, but I wasn't sure if that was still the right path. And then I thought I could maybe do a PhD too. I knew I wanted to do a terminal degree. So I ended up working in a stem cell biology lab for almost 3 years, and decided to revisit my interest in veterinary medicine. And I started kind of revisiting my interest in keeping reptiles and amphibians during that time too. I had a rescue crested gecko, and I did eventually get my chameleon, and decided to go off to veterinary school. And that kind of brings us up to date, I guess. Towards the end of vet school, I started getting really into revamping all of my enclosures for a couple reasons. There was a husbandry contest, or what was it called? There was an enrichment contest that UC Davis had for pet animals, and they were all like dog and cat stuff. And I was thinking, I could do some of that for my reptiles. My chameleon enclosure won a prize one of the years. So that was kind of cool. And then I started revamping my python enclosure too. And my roommates and I ended up with a couple of rescue dart frogs we built a whole enclosure to. So that was a good project to start, both because it was sort of a culmination of a lifetime worth of goals to get those set up, but also when COVID broke out and we were all trapped inside and kind of going crazy, that helped a lot in terms of giving me something to work on, because we were just kind of out at the end of the year. We were like about to graduate. We had like 3 months left, which is a good chunk of the year, but not enough that they're going to make anybody repeat anything. And they were basically like, okay, we don't know like what's going to happen. So go, just get out. You're done.
Yeah.
And we're like, what the heck? And then we figured out the Zoom thing that we're kind of, still using right now. But there was like a month there where we were all couldn't go anywhere. We were kind of bouncing off the walls, and I was like, I'm just gonna totally like start redoing all my enclosures and making videos about it and all that. So I guess to sum it all up, from a childhood interest in reptiles and amphibians, I ended up majoring in biology at UC Santa Barbara due to that childhood interest, and then did a few years as a biomedical researcher and went to veterinary school. And now here I am talking about it online.
Well, I think it's a really interesting observation about being able to interact with reptiles and amphibians as a kid in the wild. Because I never really thought about it that before, but I think many of us are all animal lovers, but that's probably the one group of animals that you could actually come in contact with physically. There's, like you said, you're not going to be even like handling a bird. You could never handle a bird. You can never catch a bird. And even mammals, like you're not going to really be catching mice and things like that. Like frogs and snakes are very accessible to kids. And I wonder if that's where a lot of it's just like the easiest thing to catch, and now we're all interested in it.
Right. And I mean, I'm sure I would have caught mammals if I could have. My parents were terrified I was going to get myself rabies when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's interesting.
What are you doing? Get away from that.
Yeah. I have definitely caught a few mice in my day. When I was young, we had a swimming pool, so you catch them on top of the tarp. But frogs are the easiest. And I find it interesting that even as a vet you are now, that wasn't really part of the career path originally. You weren't really sure. I think most vets I've talked to were like, I'm going to be a vet, and that was the plan the whole way through. So you actually, it took time to come to that decision. Was there something that you like? Why did you decide to end up going that way?
Right. So when I was a kid, I did want to be a veterinarian. So that was the initial plan. I always worry a bit, and not just for myself, for like any friends or family member or anybody. Goals are good, but goals that you make as a child or even as an adult, when you don't have enough information about your goal, sticking to that regardless of how life develops, I think is not always the best option. So I did not want to just sort of be blindly like, no, like this is the thing I've always been doing and I'm going to do it regardless. I wanted to kind of branch out a little bit and make sure that I knew what I was doing was the right course of action. And working in the lab helped me out a bit with that too. Ultimately, kind of the reason that I went the vet med route and not the MD route or like straight research is because I felt like it gave me the most flexibility. Like right now I'm doing all clinical stuff. I'm wondering if maybe long-term I want to see if I can get back into research. Probably wouldn't want to go do a PhD. One of my friends from school, actually, she's got her DVM and now she's like doing a joint PhD too, like after the fact. And it's like, oh man, I'd be in school till I'm 40. Yeah, I don't think I can stomach that. But it has a few different career options if you want to kind of branch out.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so I think you've already mentioned the animals that you do keep. Did you run through everything? You have the dart frogs, the ball pythons, leopard gecko, and chameleon?
So I have two Terribilis dart frogs. I have a panther chameleon right now, and I have my python he'll be turning 25 this year.
That's amazing.
I believe. Yeah. And I have a mourning gecko colony too, and the leopard gecko. And most of them are rescues. I'm trying to really not buy any more reptiles, because what I found is that when people hear that I'm a veterinarian that's interested in reptiles, they just want to like give me things.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I've got this thing I don't want anymore. Like, do you want that? And I can't take all of those, but as long as there are reptiles and amphibians that like need experienced keepers to kind of take them on, I feel like I probably shouldn't be buying more.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. And then as far as you kind of already mentioned, going through vet school and then running into those enrichment competitions and whatnot, or contests, how else did going through vet school alter your husbandry or your sort of how you thought about caring for the reptiles? Right.
So, and I want to add one thing to my education earlier that I did not mention that helped a lot, particularly with the arid environments, actually, is in between undergrad and vet school, I did 2 field biology classes through my local community college, Sacramento City College. And they have this course that is biology of the Mojave Desert. And it's like a week-long field trip, essentially, where I was already graduated. I didn't need those credits, but I was like, oh, I want to go down to the Mojave Desert. And they have permits to like capture and survey a lot of different animals. And we stayed in the Desert Studies Center in Zizix down in the Mojave, which I believe is where Attenborough stayed when they were making Life in Cold Blood. So it's got kind of a storied history there. Yeah. And so I was seeing a lot of these desert animals out in the wild. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind in terms of making arid enclosures when I eventually started switching to bioactive arid enclosures. And then in vet school, the thing that sticks out to me the most, actually, even more than the enrichment contests, was I learned that with particularly tropical lizards, but really theoretically any reptile, and any reptile that needs a lot of humidity, what tends to be the big killer of these animals is chronic kidney disease over time. And that's something that I did not know from being a hobbyist, and that I don't really see mentioned that often. And I had a Jackson's chameleon at the time that I did not realize when I obtained him that he was wild caught. So he was just never very thrifty, and he was not doing well, and I had to put him down. I was really upset about that. And I was fortunate enough to have one of my classmates and friends who has now actually become a pathologist in his own right, but he was interested in becoming a pathologist and knew all the pathologists at school. And so they did a necropsy for me to let me know what happened with my chameleon. And as I was talking to them in the pathology lab, one of the exotics vets, like the boarded zoo veterinarians, walked in and was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" We're like, "Oh, we're did a necropsy on this chameleon." He's like, "I don't know why you're even bothering doing the necropsy. It's kidney failure. It's always kidney failure." And just kind of like walked out. And I kind of thought about that and was like, huh. And I started doing a lot of research on it and the way that we keep chameleons, and realized that most of the information in America for chameleon keepers, it says, keep all mesh enclosures. They need a ton of airflow or they're going to get respiratory infections. I looked through like 50 or 100 old records at UC Davis about sick chameleons, and like barely any of them were respiratory infection. So in this area particularly, you can't keep a lot of these animals with as much ventilation as people want to keep them in. And they just need more humidity. And it's this give and take where you're in a catch-22 where they need some airflow, but they also need a lot of humidity. And if you increase the humidity, you lose airflow. And if you increase the airflow, you lose humidity. So what I ended up doing is I started looking at some European husbandry guides for chameleons. And I also found an article by, I think his name's Chris Anderson, who's a biology professor now at, I think, South Dakota. But he has a chameleon lab where he has all these chameleons, and he keeps them all in exoterras. And I went, well, I can probably do that. So I switched over to a model of still decent airflow, because you need to have vents by the bottom and at the top, so you get that chimney effect when the heat lights heat up the air. But I just blitz them with water from an automatic mister now, and I think you really have to do that. I actually was told by a guy who used to work at the Sac Zoo that the Sacramento Zoo, which is like an AZA accredited zoo, has stopped keeping chameleons because they just can't keep them alive. So I just, it's kind of this weird dynamic where, from what I can tell, most of the kind of old school chameleon husbandry guidelines were written by people who live either on the California coast or in Florida.
Yes.
And those two locations are so good for chameleons that there are like feral populations. And anywhere else, as you move like inland in America and you start getting really dry climates, like you just can't use the mesh. So kind of a tangent, but
well, it's a really important point, especially just because, that is such a broadly stated thing. And I've even seen people not even just talking about chameleons, but just in general saying, like, if you have to constantly mist, you probably don't have the enclosure set up properly. And I always think, well, yeah, you're probably in Florida where the humidity is 80% all the time, where in the winter here, it drops down to under 10%. That's just what the relative humidity is. So you have to manage it. And so just getting back to the kidney failure, was that something, was she making that comment about chameleons in general, or was that just a reptile statement in general? Most of the time it's kidney failure.
Tropical lizards. Yeah.
And is that just associated with dehydration?
It is associated with, so it's a little bit more complicated than that. The short answer is yes. The longer answer is not quite. For a couple reasons. It's really hard to pinpoint exactly what would be the cause of a chronic kidney disease, because it is something that develops over the course of years.
Right.
And I think that's why keepers don't really know about it, because everybody's worried about something that's going to make the animal really sick acutely, but over a period of years, it's not something that you really notice until it's too late. Also, what's really interesting is that some of the signs of kidney disease can mimic respiratory disease, and they can just, when they get really sick, start having like multi-organ failure. So
Gotcha.
one of the main things that causes it, this is pretty well documented, is chronic dehydration. But theoretically, you could get it from an acute infection. I guess it would be an acute kidney injury then, but you could have kidney disease that happens from infection. You could have it from hypervitaminosis D in species that get that, but you really have to be probably over supplementing them with D3 containing vitamins and also really hitting them with a UV light to get that.
Right.
And those are kind of the big ones that spring to mind. But my personal suspicion, seeing how a lot of these animals are kept, is that it is mostly dehydration. Because another species that you see it a lot with is green iguanas, and that's better documented than chameleons, just because for years and years they were like the most popular pet reptile, which is unfortunate because they're really probably one of the worst animals you could keep as a pet.
Yeah.
But when I was in school, we did see some iguanas that were like rehomed multiple times and had sort of all the scars of past husbandry mistakes on them, and people struggle to keep them humid enough because they do need a huge enclosure with a really hot basking spot. But the more you increase the heat, the more you dry out the enclosure. And
yeah, well, it is such a tricky balance, and I think just having that moisture content in the air, I'll see what you think of this. Is that because when they breathe in through their mouth, they're collecting water essentially in their mouth just through breathing? Like, is that because it's not like you can provide more water, or I mean, you can provide as much water as you want, but if the relative humidity is not appropriate in the enclosure, the dehydration can still happen.
Yeah, it's not so much that they're absorbing it from the air. There may be some degree of that, but that's likely pretty minimal. It's more just when it's really hot and dry, they are more likely to need more water than they're getting.
Gotcha.
So it kind of just increases the amount of water that they would need. And even more so than that, like chameleons in particular are notorious for not drinking.
Mm-hmm.
So they need water to be actively dripping onto leaves or having like dew collecting on leaves for them to be able to go and drink off of those leaves. So you just don't get the water staying pooled for very long if it's really hot and dry. And then they are not really adapted for a hot, dry climate. I'm saying that pretty generally. I guess some species are more arid, but similar for iguanas, I believe. And some of this information too, I should say, is not particularly well studied. That is kind of the problem with reptile medicine in general, is that there are a lot of really good resources about it, but reptiles are a very, very, very diverse group of animals, and depending on how you like split up that phylogeny, they may or may not even be like a real group. Like you need to include birds, or it's just sort of a weird amalgamation of everything that has scales. Like alligators are more related to birds than they are to lizards, and
Right.
some lizards are more related to snakes than they are to other lizards. So that's kind of the risk you run into with being too general, I think, and why I kind of hedge whenever I talk about this is that the tendency, I think, is to pick the few studies we have and be like, oh, this is a lizard.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking now about lizards. And it's like, yeah, that lizard's more related to like snakes than it is to the other lizards we're talking about. So it does get a little bit weird. But I think in general, organisms require more water as the humidity decreases and the temperature increases.
Yeah.
And you just can't keep them well hydrated if they're really hot and really dry.
Well, yeah, especially if that seems to be one of the most common causes of death, then we are certainly missing something there.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears away from the tropical species then and talk a little bit about the arid species, because you do have, like I said at the very beginning of the show, you had this great video doing an arid setup for your leopard gecko. So maybe you could just kind of run through that setup and how you built it and how you created the habitat.
Sure. So this kind of plays back to me having spent a lot of time down in the Mojave Desert. I've always loved the Mojave Desert. I went there with my parents several times when I was a kid. In undergrad, I went on a herpetology field trip to the Mojave, and then I went again with some friends over spring break. And it's really a unique environment and has a lot of unique species, a lot of unique reptiles too. And one of the animals that lives there that is one of my personal favorites, even though it's considered a pretty common, boring animal by like California herpers, is the desert banded gecko. And so that is our local eublepharid eyelid gecko species that is kind of the California equivalent of a leopard gecko. They're not the same genus, they're the same family. And if you look at like husbandry guides that I had when I was a kid, they all say like, oh, if you're going to keep pet banded geckos, you keep them like leopard geckos. They're functionally the same. And I don't know how true that really is, but you can keep them in similar setups. And what I was always interested in is when I was a kid keeping leopard geckos, I kept them in like this would have been like 1998, 1999. So I was keeping them in the kind of standard late 90s, early aughts leopard gecko setups, which is like they're going to get impacted if they're on anything.
Yes.
Don't keep them on sand because they'll get impacted if they were on sand. And I had one gecko that had been on sand for a long time and he was always fine. So I was like, well, maybe he's special. So he'll stay on sand, but everybody else is going to be on paper towels. And you get paper towels and you have two hide boxes. One's dry and one's moist. And then you have a water dish and a thing of mealworms. And you put D3 supplemented calcium in there and they just eat that and they eat the mealworms. And sometimes they get other stuff. And if you do anything else, they will immediately die. And so I did that for years and years and years when I was a kid. And I rehomed or sold off most of my geckos when I was a teenager. And I didn't really give it any thought for like several more years. But when I decided to keep leopard geckos again, and I found a rescue that needed to be rehomed, I wanted to set up a more naturalistic enclosure. And I was thinking back to kind of the husbandry guides. And I was like, well, none of that makes any sense though. Like just, it works. And I'm not saying that it's wrong, but they're not going to get immediately impacted because banded geckos and other eublepharid geckos live on loose substrate. They live on decomposed granite. They live on sandy clay. That would be a very poor adaptation for an animal that immediately dropped dead every time it was on a loose substrate. Like they're not living on bounty paper towels in the wild. That's absurd. And I was hesitant though, because I'm like, well, I don't know exactly what they're on in the wild. Let's do some research. And this is where I think vet school and my background in biology and working as a staff researcher really helped. Is I now know where to go online to find all peer-reviewed studies and how to get access to those. So I really started doing kind of a deep dive through the leopard gecko literature such that it is. And yeah, they live on loose substrate in the wild. I made in one of those videos that we're discussing, because it was a 3-part series on the Arid leopard gecko enclosure. I just sort of discussed all the stuff that I was finding. And yeah, they live on loose substrate in the wild. They live kind of semi-fossorially, at least during the day, and kind of come out at dusk. And I kind of looked at that, and I looked at all the photos I'd taken of desert banded geckos. And I think that I can just make a loose substrate, figure out how to keep some desert species and keep these guys like I would a different type of species that already is kept pretty commonly bioactively. And I suspect that it will work pretty well. And it has. There have been a few issues not with the gecko, which we can get into, but the gecko, she's doing great.
Yeah, and I mean, for those that haven't seen it, I'll make sure it's in the show notes. People can go see the actual enclosure because it did turn out amazing. So, what were the steps that you took to actually build this enclosure? Did you go collect substrate, or did you?
Sort of. So I went down in I guess that would have been June of 2020. So June of 2020, I went down to the Mojave Desert and decided like while I'm here, I can do some kind of fact finding for this, right? And so I took like some little samples of the soil there, more to look at than to actually use. I didn't really want to just take like a shovel and start digging up the ground, but I got some samples where plants were growing, some samples that are just kind of like on the top, because the whole desert is like decomposed granite from their big monzonite boulders that are everywhere. So it is kind of, the top is this kind of loose, gravelly, it's like in between gravel and sand. And then right under that is pretty well draining dirt. And then I collected some cholla cactus skeletons and a few choice rocks. And I think I took some little like dried grass or something just to add some texture until the plants grew in. But mostly it was the rocks and the cholla skeletons. And then I brought those back and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And right now I'm using a 40-gallon breeder, like that's the standard aquarium that I got off Craigslist. I do intend to redo this soon. It's next on my list, and it's going to be a custom-built enclosure, so it'll be a little bit bigger, and it won't weigh 200 pounds. Like, I'm not sure how exactly I'm going to take apart the one that I have right now. It's going to be a huge pain because it is so heavy. It can't be moved. And I realized that when I wanted to set up the rocks, because the Mojave Desert has these big rock structures. So I wanted a few rocks to kind of mimic that. And I also figured that these geckos, and I'm speaking now of banded geckos in particular, the way that you find them in the wild is they come out onto the tarmac of the road at night, because the sun cooks it all day, and then the sun goes down and they pop out and it's still warm, and they just like sit there on the road. And so you can catch them when you're road cruising. And I thought, I should have that option for my gecko. So I decided to use rocks, which would kind of be under a heat light, and then they would absorb the heat during the day. And then at night, she could come out and sit on that. And she does do that. But the problem is that rocks are extraordinarily heavy, and the enclosure is made out of glass. So I realized, okay, I'm going to have to fake it a little bit. So I have like a couple real rocks, and then I made fake rocks out of styrofoam that I carved out, and I coated those in silicone and decomposed granite that I purchased from a supplier, like a landscape supplier that sells a lot of rocks and soils. And then once that was completed, I took a photo that I had taken from the Mojave Desert. I had that blown up, and that is the background now. So it's objects I collected from the actual location, a picture I took of the location, so it kind of blends together. It's almost like a diorama, which I think is part of the reason why it turned out looking really well. And then I made a moist hide, which is integrated into the bottom of the enclosure, so it looks like a burrow, so she can climb in and out of that. And then there is another hide that is the warm hide behind the big rock structure. And then there are a couple other spots she could hide in the enclosure if she wanted to. And I got different plants that I thought would work well in an arid environment, and I was not right about all of those. The succulents I have done okay. I really wanted a plant called a California buckwheat, which is one of the main plants that grows down in the Mojave. And they are a drought-resistant plant that's sold for landscaping locally. But early on, during the COVID closures, all the places that sold native plants were totally closed. So I tried to fake it with this crappy sage plant I found at a local nursery, and it did great for a little bit, and then it just died. So I did have to, So I did replace that with the California buckwheat, which has done a lot better. And I also have a Joshua tree that I have grown from a seed. So it is several years old now, but it has seen better days. It's doing pretty well in the enclosure, but it has been gnawed on by superworm beetles. So if we can kind of maybe segue into problems with the enclosure.
Yes,
please. Was there anything else you wanted me to cover about building it?
No, I think that covers everything.
Okay.
I guess as we're talking about plants, I'll just quickly ask this question. As far as watering those plants go, are you just misting or what are you doing there?
Yeah. So, and I'll say, I guess, for the viewers out there, right? All of this is documented pretty well in the 3 videos I've made. So I would recommend watching them, not just as a shameless plug, but also because all of this stuff has just become like a jumbled, non-linear narrative in my mind. So I don't know if I'm doing the best job of explaining it from start to finish. But the presumption I'm making, probably unfairly, is that everybody already knows how to set up a functional bioactive enclosure. So the overall 20,000 feet down view, right, is you need like a drainage layer, you need substrate, and then you need plants that go into the substrate, and you have to have something to separate the drainage layer from the substrate.
Mm-hmm.
So the drainage layer I have is just the normal clay lake, whatever those hydro balls are called that are used for hydroponics. And then there is a fiberglass window screen on top of that. And then there is substrate that I made out of decomposed granite, clay topsoil, compost topsoil, and some like regular cocoa fiber. And that has worked okay. I'm probably going to experiment with a slightly different mix for my next build. I'm not 100% sure what that will be. It'll be similar, but maybe a little bit differently. I found a couple things online where folks have said if you add like organic fertilizer to it, it might help a little bit. So that's kind of the rough way that it was set up in terms of growing the plants. I had a couple different succulent species, the Joshua tree, the ill-fated sage, and the buckwheat that's done really well. So those are the plants I've had. Then I crushed up magnolia leaves to have some leaf litter. And then we have the structures that I kind of talked about. And you can see that in the videos. And in terms of how that has all worked, it seems to have worked pretty well. For watering, I try and mist it. And initially I was like, it's an arid environment. I'll mist it maybe once a week. I think that's not enough. I think you probably need to mist it at least twice a week, maybe like every other day. I've taken to basically a flash flood model right now, which I don't know that I would advocate for people. Like, you got to be careful with that if you're keeping animals in there. But the way that it's currently set up is that my gecko spends most of her time in her underground hide, which is literally like a sculpted piece of Tupperware. So it looks like it's part of the enclosure, but really it's raised up a little bit. Mm-hmm. So I just pour like a ton of water into her water dish and it overflows. And it creates a temporary little flash flood like the desert where the water level like rises an inch up, which is not high enough to get to the gecko. And then all of the cleanup crew that are in the soil panically like rush to the top. And I see all of them and go like, that's where I screwed up. There are too many of those things in here. And then it goes bloop and it goes down into the drainage layer, and the plants are able to pull from the drainage layer because they do have roots now that have gone through the substrate barrier. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, why don't we run through some of the problems that have arose in this whole setup?
So overall, it's done well other than the sage. But the biggest screw up that I made, and I discussed in my very first video, like, I'm going to do a cleanup crew. There's no information online about what kind of cleanup crew to use. So I'm just going to throw all of the things and see what sticks. That was not a good idea. And it was not a good idea because desert environments are much more nutrient poor than like a tropical environment. So if you have a tropical bioactive setup with dark frogs or lizards or something like that, yes, the animals are going to poop, and that is something that the cleanup crew will take care of. But really, you're getting a lot of leaf litter and waste that falls from your plants too. And like what I do in my chameleon enclosure is all those plants grow on like a weekly basis and try and take everything over, and they kind of grow up, and I cut them all back and I chop them up and I throw them into the enclosure. And that's like self-propagating leaf litter. That does not happen in an arid enclosure. There's some leaf litter kind of, but like succulents don't really shed leaves. Shrubs do, but at a pretty low rate. And if you put in your own leaf litter, if you don't keep it pretty moist, it will dry out so much that the cleanup crew doesn't have anything to eat. So what I suspect has happened, and I would have to break the whole thing down to really confirm this, but I think that the super worms that I put in, because I'm like, this is a good idea, they are a horrendous pest now. So I would say do not use super worms as a cleanup crew. You will see folks online say that is something that works, and maybe there are contexts where it does, but if you are making like a true arid enclosure, those things will destroy it because they are unkillable. They can eat styrofoam, they can eat dried leaves, but what they really want is moisture. And so they will just chew on everything. They'll turn into beetles. Like, I frequently have to go in there and I pull out like 10 beetles.
Yeah.
They're self-propagating. There's so many of them in there. And
they smell terrible when you kill them.
I know. Well, they smell terrible when you touch them. So you don't even have to kill them. You just have to pick one of those stupid beetles out. Because I just go in. Yeah. And then they get freaked out and they spray you with whatever chemical smells terrible. And then my hands are covered in beetle goo or something. It's awful. I hate those things so much. My girlfriend was looking in there recently and she's like, why are there all these beetles? And I was like, they're more. It's like, there's too many beetles.
Yeah.
I don't like the beetles. And it's like, I don't like the beetles either, but I can't get rid of the beetles. So
yeah. Well, and even as the superworms themselves, I had an enclosure set up where I had this fake background, and there was just like one area where they could get behind, and it was full of like inflatable, or what do you call it, expandable foam. You couldn't see it in front of the enclosure, but it was behind. And then sometimes I'm feeding my gecko, you drop a superworm, and they're just immediately burrowed into the soil. You can never find them again. But then all of a sudden, a couple days later, you just hear like chick, 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 and they're just chewing on the inside of this expandable foam on the other side of the background. You can never get to them, and then you just hear them chewing, and it is so annoying. I
don't know if I should be admitting this, but years ago, before I had my because I'm on sort of like generation 2, moving on to generation 3 of my bioactive enclosures. So I've been keeping kind of rudimentary bioactive enclosures since like 2015 or 16. But the first ones, I had a drainage layer, but I was using like potting soil and it just didn't work very well. And in that early incarnation, I did have the like standard Exoterra foam backdrop that just literally looks like foam that somebody painted a rock onto.
Yeah.
And superworms got through that and were just eating, and it would be like the and there were like many nights where I just couldn't take it. And I'd like take the chameleon I had then, my late Jackson's chameleon, out, and he went into a new enclosure. And then I had like an airsoft gun, and I'd sit there and I'd listen, and I'd go, and I'd go, and I'd listen again. It would go, and I'd go, and then just nothing.
That's
amazing. And it's like, okay, but then I'm sitting there reflecting. I'm like, okay, this is a terrible system. If I'm like a lunatic, like I'm at 3 a.m. and I'm like,
to shoot your cleanup crew.
Yes. I'm like blasting through the background, listening to it. So, I've been better about keeping them from escaping in the tropical enclosures. And also, like Spicoli, my panther chameleon, he will kill and eat superworm beetles. He does not care if they smell bad. So if they get into the back and form a pupa or whatever, and they come back out as a beetle, like whoop, gone. The gecko does not like them at all. Like she will run away from them. And so they just like, they've kind of been running the cage, and they, to get back to what my original point was before I went on an insane tirade about airsoft guns, they're bad for the arid environments because they reproduce so quickly. So they just take over everything, and there's just no way that they're not eating the roots of those plants. So I suspect that that's what killed the sage to begin with, because I had tested out my initial round of plants in the substrate that I made for like a month. Like this was taking me forever to make. So I potted a bunch of plants. I put them outside. I took good care of them. I kept them watered. They got sunlight. And I was watching them to see if they would be able to live in the substrate. And they were all doing fine. And I put them into the enclosure, and they did great for like a few months until that superworm beetle population ticked up. And that's when they kind of started declining. So I suspect that their roots are just constantly being eaten by those stupid worms.
Yeah. They're too aggressive.
Yeah. So that's the big issue that I've had, is the cleanup crew. The other kind of minor antagonist is I use 3 types of isopods. And I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of the scientific names for like the isopod nerds who know everything about them. Mm-hmm. I've only read these names. I don't know how to pronounce them at all. But there's the like common roly-polies. It's like Armadillidium vulgare or something like that, A vulgare. I like those. And I have a population of those that I collected just from my yard years and years ago. And they've been in culture for like 5 or 6 years now. And they grow pretty slowly, and they're pretty tolerant of dry conditions. I had a couple viewers message me and say that they see them in their gardens, actually in the Mojave Desert. Another one that I've used is the P. pruinosis. I'm trying to remember what the hobbyist name for them is. It's Porcellioides pruinosis, and they're the powder orange is what they're called. Powder orange isopods. And then the third one I used is giant orange, which are Porcellio scaber. And all three of those are like quasi domestic species that live in people's gardens, and they've all kind of made it into the Mojave Desert and Sonora deserts and seem to be doing okay in like irrigated areas anyway. And so I thought these will be good ones to try. And I would recommend using either the roly-polies, the avulgare, or the P. scaber, and not using the powder orange P. pruinosis, because those things have taken over too. They reproduce extremely quickly, and there are just tons of them. The other two grow pretty slowly. So when I redo this, there'll be no superworms. There will be no powder orange isopods, and I'm probably just going to use the roly-polies and see how that does. I think that'll work a lot better because they also don't burrow into the ground, so they're not going to be eating my plants from like the roots up.
Yeah, you always have to be suspicious when a population explodes. You're like, you're eating something.
Yes,
something's
exactly.
going down.
Right. And so then it's like a battle where I can put in extra food to try and pull them away from the roots, right? But then I'm just giving them extra fuel to reproduce.
Yeah.
So I'll do that and I'll see them eating it and I'll be like, all right, stay away from the roots. And then I'll look in and there'll just be more of them. And I'm just like, oh, shit.
Yeah.
So that is a potential issue. Another interesting issue that I've had is I also have a population of crickets now. So there are actual crickets. I'm on like generation 3 of crickets.
Oh, wow.
Which is potentially a concern because crickets are known to chew on herps. I think that happens more in sterile enclosures where they don't have any other options. Because, there's in the wild, there's going to be more insects than predators, and you don't get like roving bands of crickets devouring healthy wild herps. So that hasn't really been an issue. There aren't that many of them. And I put in like carrots and stuff to try and draw them away from the plants, but it's almost, as an ecosystem, it is almost functioning too well. Like I was not anticipating providing an environment that crickets could reproduce in, and I'm not really sure how I'm going to deal with that in the future. Probably just not feeding crickets, because what they've been doing too is they have been growing, and these are the Grilloides species, because there was like the house cricket was the old school one that everybody used, and then that virus wiped them out in like the mid 2000s, and they were replaced with the smaller, I think they're called the Indian house cricket. So they're not an aggressive species. I'm not really worried about them hurting the gecko, but they do mature very quickly and start chirping. So I've had just like a bunch of males grow up over a period of weeks and then like start chirping in the middle of the night, because this is in my room.
I can hear you loading the airsoft already.
Yeah, no more airsoft. I've moved on from that, but I have spent a couple nights like trying to look in there because it's planted so densely now. There's like grass that has grown up around the back, and they hide in the grass. So it's been like 2 a.m. I've been like trying to sift through to find these stupid crickets. So be careful about what invertebrates get into the enclosure, I guess, because they reproduce, for whatever reason, these species seem to reproduce a lot better in the arid enclosure than they do in the tropical ones, or at least they cause more of a problem when they're reproducing in the arid enclosure.
Yeah, no, that is some really good advice. And I know you had springtails in there as well, but are they still thriving in there, or did they? I mean, springtails are typically more of a tropical species, but
oh yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'd forgotten about the springtails because the springtails are their own thing. I did not introduce springtails; they just sort of sprung up out of nowhere because I was using all the like cage furniture is sourced from the desert. And I was like, I'm not going to sterilize this. Like I'm just going to, I'll hose it off, but whatever microfauna is on it stays on it. And we'll see what happens. And I got what I think are, and I need to caveat this again by saying, I don't know how to pronounce any of these Latin names or if I'm 100% right about this, because springtails are really hard to identify. And there isn't like a really diehard sub-community of springtail enthusiasts that I can rely on for IDs, at least not that I've been able to find. I think they're like a Tomoceras species. There is a species of very large springtails that you will occasionally see offered online as feeders for small frogs and lizards, but they're notoriously difficult to culture, and they don't culture well in the conditions that folks usually use for them. So they don't grow well on charcoal, and I think they don't grow well on clay either, but I'm not sure if that's been well investigated. And I'm pretty sure I have a species of those that just kind of popped up because they're big. They're like probably the size of a pinhead cricket at their largest. And they just kind of showed up, and they're still going strong. I tried to isolate them. I was unable to. So that there's that population, and there's another population of silver springtails, which I have been able to isolate. And those seem to be a species that does pretty well in arid environments too. They do need a moist retreat, but the moist hide and the area under the water dish seems to be enough to keep them going. But I didn't introduce either of those. They just kind of sprung into being.
Yeah, that's the same in my enclosures. These springtails just pop up out of nowhere. Yeah. I think, well, I guess they're good to be in that environment if they're finding themselves there. Is there any other than the cleanup crew, that's some really great advice and walking through the drainage layer and whatnot. Is there any other advice that you have for people that want to set up an arid bioactive setup?
Yes. And that, I think that advice would be, don't be afraid to go outside of like designated reptile products or commercial products. Or maybe, I don't want to empower people to do anything too insane, but like, just understand that I guess what I'm trying to say, understand that not everything is going to ship to your door from Amazon because these products don't exist yet. So I get a lot of messages from people on Instagram or YouTube being like, oh, what product did you use for the decomposed granite? And it's like, there is no product. Like I went to a landscaping supplier and they had a giant pile of probably, 100 tons or something of this granite. It's like, you could climb up it. It's like a mountain. And I said, I want to fill up this Home Depot bucket with decomposed granite. How much is that? And they laughed at me and were like, okay, weirdo, whatever, like $2.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. So I filled it up with that, and it cost $2. And then I went home and I got some topsoil there too. So that's not stuff that you can buy commercially for vivarium purposes because, and it will never be, to be clear. Like there's no way that could ever be commercially viable because it weighs so much.
Right.
So, it's not like Arcadia or Zoo-Med are going to start shipping like, exactly. Like a 15-pound bag of granite, and it's like this big, and you'd have to charge like $80 or something for that to be financially viable. So you will need to kind of go outside of the typical like Home Depot or Amazon to get some of these supplies. We'll see if some of the commercially made arid substrates end up panning out. Like I know Arcadia has I don't actually remember what it's called. They have their arid substrate that I'm curious about, but currently when we had talked a little bit about this, it currently appears to be illegal in the United States.
Oh, they don't have it at all there.
No. I'm not sure why. I think it has to do with importing soil. I sort of went down a USDA rabbit hole and was looking at how to get like a permit for that. And I was like, okay, this is too much. I'm going to kind of take a step back. So that's not available in the States right now. And then, what's that guy's name? Biodude guy.
Josh
Halter.
Sorry,
Josh Halter, Biodude.
Yes, Josh from Biodude. Yeah.
Yeah. He's got his Terra Sahara thing, which I have no idea what that is either.
And I think it's the opposite. We don't have that in Canada. I think it's the same issue.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah,
it's illegal here.
So in terms of like commercial products, there's the Arcadia soil, which I've not heard like great things about, but I don't have any personal experience with it, so I can't comment on that. Mm-hmm. And then there's the Biodude stuff that I also don't know that much about, but again, part of the issue there is to make like an arid substrate, you're going to have to make it, if you're trying to sell it, it would have to be pretty light. So you're probably not going to be able to include much sand or rock in it, which is maybe okay, but you wouldn't get the same effect that I currently have with my enclosure. So I think that's been kind of frustrating for people, is they see mine and they go like, well, I don't know where to get that stuff. And it's like, you kind of just need to look at like landscape suppliers and call around a little bit. Like, you're not going to be able to go to websites because these are like wholesale places intended for contractors, and they don't have neat websites set up. Like, you're going to need to actually call them or drive there. So,
well, and like you said, it's when you're buying stuff for landscaping, it's a joke how cheap it is, because you're buying such a small quantity. It actually works out well on our side.
Right, exactly. So, and that's the benefit, is that these supplies are intended for making a huge yard. So they're expecting to sell like multiple truckfuls of this.
Yeah.
So if you go there and you're like, I need 5 gallons of it, they like literally will just like laugh at you and be like, all right, like let's call it like $3, $5.
Yeah, they
like,
don't even know how to weigh it out. They're just
Right. They don't care.
Yeah.
Like, you could probably just be like, I don't want to pay anything. And they'd just be like,
yeah,
sure, whatever.
Take your bucket.
Yeah. It's not worth my time arguing with you about it. So you do kind of have to get out of the kind of designated lanes, so to speak, to source supplies. And I'm not sure if decomposed granite is something you can get everywhere. I expect it would be pretty widely available in the United States. I don't know if that's something you've seen in Canada. I don't know if you've been looking.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen it. And I go to garden stores all the time, but I may have not just walked past it without realizing, type thing.
Yeah.
Is it essentially just granite that's been, starting to essentially, I don't want to use the word decompose in the definition here, but just granite that's falling apart, basically? So it's like sand?
Basically. Yeah. That's my understanding. And I'm no geologist, of course, but this, like the monzonite structures in the Mojave Desert are basically just big. At one point I knew this. I looked up all this, but they're pretty similar to granite, but they are weathered not by water, but by like wind and sand. So they're a lot rougher. And as that sort of gets worn off, it turns into decomposed granite. And I'm not actually sure where it gets sourced from, but I mean, you could have a quarry down in the Mojave where you just indefinitely filled up trucks of that. And it's not, it seems like a nearly infinite resource, at least in California.
Yeah, no, that is some really good tips for sure. I think people do need to expand beyond just what the reptile companies sell, and there's a lot of opportunity there. So I think that's awesome. Was there any other pieces of advice? I think that's pretty much rounded it all off.
Yeah, I think those are the main ones. Would be really cognizant of cleanup crew and learn from my I don't want to say failed experiment, but suboptimal experiment where you don't want to look less is more with these enclosures, with the arid enclosures, from what I can tell so far, as opposed to the tropical enclosures where you really can put in several species of isopod and it'll be like totally fine. So you want like a slow species of drought tolerant, or excuse me, a slow growing species of drought tolerant isopods. You're probably not going to be able to buy arid springtails, but if you have an access to some like pieces of cage furniture that have been taken from an arid environment, or even if you don't really bare root your plants, you'll probably get some arid springtails in there. And I wouldn't be too afraid about introducing stuff into the enclosure personally. So kind of less is more with the cleanup crew. Don't be afraid to go to places that aren't geared towards reptile hobbyists in order to buy your supplies. And I guess the other one would be, don't be too afraid of items that you collect from the wild. And this is sort of an editorial. I don't know that there's like a totally right or wrong answer here, but people seem to be like very, very concerned about contamination, like the vague notion of this might be contaminated. And I always kind of laugh at that, because it's like, okay, so if I go get a stick that's been in a desert wash for 3 months and it's super dry, right? Like that's contaminated by like Facebook logic. But if you go to a pet store and you buy a piece of like Zoomed branded grape wood that is agricultural waste, because these things aren't grown for reptiles, right? They're grown for wine, and then they get them and sandblast them. And then that thing is stored underneath 40 different species of animals that are coming in and out because the store is selling it. And it's got exposure to, like, hypothetical exposure anyway, to hundreds of different species of exotic animals, all with their own various diseases. Like, that stuff's not sanitized or baked after going to the store. Like, that is a way worse risk than anything that you're going to find out in the desert that has probably not been touched by any other reptile species for the last 6 months. Like,
yeah.
And it's not a problem. I'm not saying everybody should be worried about that, but really you don't see a lot of issues from pieces of cage furniture. Like, it's not like get those and then folks lose half their collection to like pesticide or something. It just doesn't really happen. It's a hypothetical risk, but I just don't think that because something has been packaged by a company and they put like a logo on it, that means it's 100% safe. Like, I don't really think that makes it any safer than something that you are able to obtain on your own, provided that you're using kind of reasonable discretion. Obviously, if it's somewhere that is spraying a ton of pesticides, or it's like literally from a commercial farm, maybe you want to be concerned about that. But I've got a lot of manzanita that I traded. I was trading arid springtail cultures for a while, and manzanita, which sells for a lot of money actually in like herb shops and aquarium stores, grows locally as essentially like yard waste up in the foothills. And people just they just cut it down and they burn it. They're just like piles of it that you see driving around up in the foothills here. So I just found some people who lived up there and wanted springtails. So I was like, hey, if you like cut me a bunch of manzanita, I'll give you some springtails. So yeah, I've been using that. It's been working great.
Well, and I've heard that same logic with people talking about going to gardening stores to get your substrates and whatnot, just because, you hear those sometimes horror stories where people buy a bag of substrate from a pet store and it could have, snake mites in it, for example, because it's been sitting there and who knows how it got contaminated. But, you can't get that from a gardening store, essentially. No, so it is kind of that thing where we think if it's in a pet store, it must be clean. Well, it's not necessarily true.
Right. I think it's probably the dead opposite, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the 25-year-old ball python, because I think that he's had an interesting story, especially recently. So why don't you why don't we first start with just the original enclosure you had him in, and then we can kind of go from there, if that's a good place to start.
Sure. So I got him when I was 7 years old, and he was, to the best of my recollection, about, I think, 6 months old. He was very, very small. And so I raised him up again using like 90s husbandry standards. So back in the late 90s, when I was getting into all of this, we had internet. My mom worked for the paper and my dad for the state. So we had like DSL before a lot of people had really good internet, but there was nothing on the internet at that time. And it's easy. Like, I think about this every once in a while because I take like Wikipedia and everything for granted, but like, Wikipedia for years and years. I mean, Wikipedia wasn't around until like 2004 or something, like in earnest. And it was like a joke at the time, like an actual punchline. Everything on it was fake. So there was nowhere to get reptile information except published books. And there was like the Advanced Vivarium series was the one that everybody looked at, with like the Leopard Gecko manual and the ball python manual and all that stuff. And so I got all my information from those, and there's still a lot of good information in those books. But the kind of the standard at the time was, if you're breeding ball pythons, you keep them in racks. So you just keep tubs, and you just can have, it's like, it's not animal hoarding, because we're not calling it that, right?
Yeah.
Just like a bunch of shelves where we have snakes. And even as a kid, I was like, that's kind of weird, but whatever. So I had him in, when I first got him, in probably like a 20-gallon glass enclosure, something that's been lost to the ages. I don't know where that was. And when he got a little bit bigger, we got him a custom-made wood enclosure that had a single socket up at the top that you'd screw in like a ceramic heat emitter or a bulb, and did not have a cover because nobody told us to have a cover. And I was a small child.
Yeah.
And he had like a hide box and a water dish that he could submerge into and just use newspapers. I think I kind of alternated between newspapers and aspen shavings over the years because the husbandry guides would sort of say one was bad and then they would switch and say the other one was bad. So I was kind of always like switching back and forth. So he was in that for years and years and years. I only fed him live mice and rats because honestly at the time you couldn't buy pre-killed because I'm from Sacramento, California, and I got him, which is the capital of California for those who don't know, but is not like anywhere near the biggest city in California. So the Bay Area is where the East Bay Vivarium is, which is like one of the oldest herb stores in the country and where I got a lot of these animals when I was a kid. So you could get frozen mice and rats in the Bay Area, but you couldn't really get them in California or in Sacramento yet. So I would get live mice and rats and feed him those. And I knew that they were potential danger. So I'd feed them and then I'd sit there and I'd watch and I'd set a timer for like 10 minutes and I'd sit there. And if the timer went off, I'd pull it out and go, nope, like you're not eating this week, which was a huge problem because I always had like extra mice and rats that he didn't eat. And I'm like, what am I doing with this now?
That's quite an experience as a young person too, like live feeding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was not my favorite aspect of keeping that animal by any means.
Yeah.
I did not enjoy it. I did. Well, the pet store that we would get the mice and rats from was like a pretty sketchy pet store too in hindsight, but we worked out a deal with them where we called it like the rental rat, where we'd go and we'd get a rat and he wouldn't eat it and then I'd take it back and they'd just take it back and we'd just be like, no, you owe us a rat. And we just kind of do that. So that worked okay for years and years. And at one point I upgraded him to a larger wooden enclosure too, but I think he was probably in the equivalent of like, I think it comes out to about 30 gallons or maybe like 35 gallons. It's just shy of 40, I think. I think it's like 35. Still with a single socket. I had some extra UVB tubes and there was a UVB tube thing in the bigger one. So I would occasionally use UVB with him, but I never saw it just because I had it and I never saw him come out or anything. So I ended up not really using that because the old school UVB tubes are like a weird color too. Mm-hmm. So point being, for years and years, I'm using the like 90s style husbandry. I go off to college and I rehomed most of my reptiles that I had when I was a kid, but I kept my snake. He was my first one. And my parents were taking care of him when I was at college. And he either got bit by a rat or burned himself on the light. And I will never know which, because by the time I came back and checked on him, it was healed. But he does have a scar now on his head, and it's been there for a decade. It doesn't seem to be causing any problems. But that was a wake-up call to still teenage me. I was probably like 19 or something. And I put on a cover on that bulb, which we'd never had on there because nobody had told us that we needed it. Mm-hmm. And I kind of off and on been trying to switch him to pre-killed rodents once those became commercially available, and he just would not eat them. And I talked to the vivarium where I got him, and they're like, yeah, like some of these older pythons just won't eat pre-killed. And I tried all of the stuff that's like, I don't even want to get into it too much, but just like you do various things to try and make it the smell more enticing to them, and none of that was working.
Yeah.
I tried killing a rat freshly, which was very unpleasant, and he didn't eat that either. He once went a year without eating, like a solid year. And he was 18 or 19 at the time, and I remember thinking like, maybe this is the end. Maybe this is just how old snakes die. They just stop eating. But I kept weighing him, and he never lost any weight. I remember like talking to the folks at the vivarium, and I think I called like an exotics vet too, and they're just like, I mean, if he's not losing any weight,
it's good to go.
Like, yeah, just kind of tough it out, I guess. And yeah, and then at the year point, I offered him a live rat, and he ate it. And so So for years and years, I had been kind of doing the same thing, 90s style husbandry. Eventually added a cover to the bulb. Tried to switch him over to pre-killed when that became available, but he wasn't having it. And so I'd sort of been working on other enclosures. Like I'd already made my dart frog enclosure. I had upgraded my chameleon. I was on version 2 of the bioactive chameleon enclosure already. And I thought, really my snake's been with me the longest. He needs a bigger enclosure. I can use some of the bioactive skills that I have learned to upgrade him. And I'd read a couple anecdotal reports of snakes feeding better when they had larger areas to kind of prowl around in. And I thought, that's interesting. Maybe I can finally get him to eat pre-killed rodents. And it worked like a charm. I bought a very large enclosure. It's about 36 inches tall, 2 feet deep, and about 2 feet wide. So it is taller than it is wide. But I set it up with multi-levels, so he has got a couple hides he can go into and a very large bowl that he can kind of swim in or at least submerge in. And this is, I have videos of all this too, if folks want to take a look at it. And I planted it with pretty hardy plants that were sort of shielded from his ability to squish them with various elements of cage furniture. So they grow out from underneath it. So he wasn't really putting a lot of pressure on it. And that took a while to get acclimated because I kept him in his old enclosure and I was setting up this new one. I was really cognizant of the fact I had not done this before with a snake. So I was checking all the parameters, making sure that the temperature stayed within range over a period of weeks and that the humidity was appropriate and that he had a hot area and a cooler area and that he could go into the water. And when that was all ready to go, I put him into this enclosure and he immediately took to it. And the pattern that I would notice is when he would get hungry, he would become much more active and he'd climb the branches and he'd be out and he'd be like looking. And he started taking pre-killed rats, like for the first time ever. And
that's really amazing. Like,
yeah,
that's like 2 decades.
Yeah.
That's
more.
incredible.
So I was really pleased with that. And this was when I was still a student and I was in Davis. And Davis is where the University of California Vet School is. And it's its own town, sort of, but pragmatically, it's a suburb of Sacramento. And when I moved back to Sacramento after I graduated from vet school and started working as a veterinarian, I moved from where I was previously in Davis, where I was on the second story in a really well-insulated house, to the house that I am in now, which is a single story and it is not very well insulated. So the room that I am in right now that I have him in gets a lot colder at night, and it's like bigger temperature shifts. So it warms up during the day and then it will get really cold at night. And I was a little bit apprehensive about that because I bought this enclosure and retrofitted it for the snake. I did not build it from scratch. And it had 2 sides that were completely mesh. And as I had discussed earlier in this conversation, I kind of hate mesh enclosures, but I thought, well, I'll plug one completely. So I have one of those covered completely up. And then everything's on a thermostat. So, well, as long as it's able to heat up, really it shouldn't matter if there is a lot of change in the temperature of the actual room because the heating element will compensate for that on the thermostat. And I checked a bunch, made sure that was the case, and it seemed to be working pretty well. So I wasn't too concerned about it. He's doing well. He's still eating. But I'm always paranoid about this stuff. So I have like redundant checks in place. So I have a thermostat on this enclosure that was set in his hide to the spot that was sort of his warm hide. And that was set at 90, like 92, 95. And that's where I had found that if I kept the temperature pretty high there, he could go in there when he wanted to be warm. He could come out when he didn't. And that temperature there would keep the surrounding area kind of high 80s. And then it would be in the 70s in the rest of the enclosure. And I had a second thermometer to check the ambient temperature that was outside that stuck to the wall. And so when I would check on him, I would check the thermostat thermometer to make sure that the warm area was as warm as I wanted, and the ambient thermometer to basically double check and calibrate the thermostat, because the thermostat I was using was, it couldn't be calibrated. It was just like, this is what it is.
Right. Yeah. Like a dial or something.
Yeah. And so that worked for a while, but then the way that my old job worked, I worked a lot of overnight ER shifts, and we would work like 2 weeks of ER shifts at a time, with like several nights where we're pulling like 15 or 18 hour shifts. And then we go home and like pass out for a few hours, and you got to start it over again. And it was exhausting. COVID caseload for ER veterinarians was like through the roof. We'd be seeing on a lot of nights like as much stuff at 3 a.m. as we were seeing it at 8 p.m. or like 5 p.m. It was crazy. And during those overnight shifts and rounds, I would be doing kind of minimal maintenance on animals. Like everybody still got fed and watered and checked on, but I wasn't doing as much like, all right, time to prune all of the leaves in your enclosure. And so I went in to check on the snake and realized that his thermometer was out. So the thermostat's still working, but the thermometer has burned out, and it's just one of the little digital ones that you get on Amazon. And I had like a stash of those that I would use to replace them, but I was out of them. So I put it on my to-do list, like, okay, I got to get more of those. Thermostat seems to be still working. Snake seems like he's doing fine. Move on to the next thing. And went through my next couple like weeks of these overnights, and I'm coming off overnights, and I realized that he's just acting kind of erratically now. Like he was coming out of his hide a lot more than he usually does, and like bouncing around the cage. Like he would like climb up the side, and he would sort of like fall back and looked like he was like looking for something. And usually when he was doing that, it would mean that he was hungry. So I tried feeding him, and he didn't want to eat it. And that was the first time that he had refused a prey item since I switched him over to the new enclosure. So I was like, well, that's odd. But I mean, he used to refuse to eat fairly frequently, so I wasn't like too worried about it yet. And I took him out. I did like an exam on him, and he seemed okay. So I put him back, checked the temperature again. It was normal. Ordered some more of those thermometers. And over the next few days, he was just like really, it's hard to say agitated with the snake, because that's almost like anthropomorphizing them, but he just seemed like agitated, like he was coming out of his out of his hide, moving around a lot. He was like trying to bask, which was kind of abnormal for him. And I took him out again, and I heard like a little bit of a wheeze, like just for like kind of. And I'd listen again, I wouldn't hear it, and I went like, oh shoot. And I was concerned because he was 23 or 24 at the time, and that's old for a snake. And anytime you've like a really old animal that suddenly starts having respiratory issues, I always worry, like, does it ever seeing like cancer?
Right.
Because that's something that happens in animals that are old. And I kind of took a breath though, and was like, okay, I don't really have any reason to think that. Let's stick to the most likely. Something is screwed up with husbandry, because husbandry tends to be the most common problem, right? So let's check everything. Don't have my new thermometers yet. Let's get the old temp gun. So I start checking all the temperatures in the cage, and I realize like the thermostat is just like has come wildly uncalibrated for no apparent reason. Like it's like 10 degrees cooler than it says it is. It's saying like, oh yeah, the hide is 95 degrees. And it was like 80 or 85 or something. And that of course means the rest of the enclosure is much cooler, like
right.
Probably not mid 70s, like mid 60s. And that's during the day. So it might have been dipping down even more at night. And I'm just like, oh shoot, like why did this happen? So I took him out. I set up, I actually got all my old equipment from back in the day that I hadn't used for a long time. Like I had this old 90s era snap together heat pad with like that old heat tape. And so I set up a hospital enclosure with like a big tub I bought from Home Depot, drilled out some air holes, put it on the heat tape, set that up with a different thermostat that I had that was testing as reliable. Did a little bit of research, found out that at least anecdotally, like 87 degrees was the perfect temperature to keep ball pythons for like metabolizing antibiotics. And I put him in there and started him on some antibiotics with the presumption that this was like the start of bacterial pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did some blood work on him. It was boring. There's nothing that interesting there. And started thinking like, okay, well, what can I really do without going to like a specialist? And my old clinic had a CT scanner and X-ray capabilities, obviously. We had radiologists who'd come in and out. And I found one of the radiologists who actually had some experience reading out Python CTs. And she was like, don't do X-rays, radiographs or X-rays. Don't do X-rays. Start with CT. You need CT for snakes. And I can probably tell, like, I can't tell you 100% if it's bacterial pneumonia, obviously, but I can probably tell you whether it's pneumonia or cancer, which sounds like is your primary goal at this point. And so we did that. I had to sedate him and put him into a poster tube to get him perfectly straight.
Mm-hmm.
And we put him in. I can actually send you some pictures of it. It was kind of interesting looking. So he goes into the CT and we scan him and we get it read out, and it looks like bacterial pneumonia. And so over the next few weeks, he's improved on the antibiotics. I was planning to sedate him again and do like another check to make sure that it had been radiographically cured, but he didn't respond very well to the sedation. It took like days for it to wear off, which isn't unheard of for reptiles, but for like a animal in his 20s, it is taking several days to come out of just regular sedation, which is, for comparison, something that would wear off in like 2 hours in a dog. I was like, okay, I think that it's probably riskier to resedate him than it is to just go off of clinical science instead of doing another CT. But once that was all done, so I kept him in this tub for a couple months and kept him under really strict temperature guidelines, was giving him the antibiotics every 3 days, as is the published recommendations for ball pythons. And he made a great recovery. And by then it had warmed up a bit, and I put him back in his big bioactive enclosure for the spring and summer. But I thought like, okay, well, this was a big like scare here, because this enclosure, which worked so great in the location in my old house,
mm-hmm. has
like not been ideal at all in the new location. And part of that is due to the thermostat too, right? Like fundamentally the thermostat failed, and that is why I had an issue. And I did have a backup to let me know when the thermostat would fail, but that had itself failed prior to the thermostat failing.
Yeah.
So it was a very unfortunate set of circumstances. And that also happened when I was working 80+ hour weeks and I was just like exhausted. So it was the only period of time where I would not have noticed
Murphy's Law
immediately. Yeah, exactly. It was like I was exhausted. The thing that was supposed to catch the thermostat failed, and the thermostat failed in a way that it still looked like it was working.
And so, had that happened in your original house, it would have been okay, probably.
Right, exactly, because it just didn't get that cool at night. So what probably would have happened had that happened in the original house is, that room stayed in like the low 70s, mm-hmm. and that's, from what I've seen, published guidelines for ball pythons is like they shouldn't get cooler than like 72 degrees.
Right. And
that room never really got cooler than 72 degrees. So what I would have suspected in that old house, if that had happened, is I probably would have tried to feed him and he wouldn't have eaten because he was cold and not using much energy. And I would have gone, that's weird. And then tested everything and gone, oh, it's a little bit too cool. And then there wouldn't have been any fallout at all. But since I was in a new location, it was just worse than it could have been. And I did catch it pretty easily. I did catch it pretty early. I don't think that any of that equipment had been malfunctioning for more than 3 weeks at max.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was probably more like 2, but it was between 2 and 3 weeks. And, if I had not been paying close attention, I think it probably could have been worse. So I'm happy that I caught it early. But then again, the takeaway message is like redundancy is key. So I had my one redundant thermometer. I now have 2. Actually, I might have 3 in there right now because I'm super paranoid. But I have the digital one. I have a old school like aquarium thermometer that suction cups to the glass,
Yeah.
and then I bought a bunch of these little thermometer strips too. For like $10, you get a bunch of them, and I've stuck those to all my enclosures too as like a final fail safe, which is maybe overkill, but I mean, doing all of that is still more time and resource effective than waiting until after you have a sick animal.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I think another really important part of the story is understanding illness when you see it, because like you said, it's not necessarily like you were looking at the python and saying, okay, that's definitely an RI. You just notice something slightly different in its behavior, and that's really a good cue for people to know that you have to be able to engage with your animals on a regular basis. And if you have too many, how would you ever have noticed that?
Right. And that's, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's like it's number of animals to some extent. And I have tried really consciously to not have too many animals, because I think a lot of people who keep reptiles, you do need something to work on and to strive towards. And that can be building cool environments and maybe accumulating different species of plants or something like that, where you can kind of focus that energy not on just accumulating animals. Or if you just buy everything pre-made, it just turns into like, okay, I got 1 snake, I'm bored with that. Next snake.
Yeah, exactly.
Next snake. And then pretty soon, you're on the news and the cops have raided your house or whatever. And it's like, oh, I never thought that guy was so crazy, but he had 800 snakes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, I mean, I would encourage people to try to do DIY whenever possible. If you have the time and capabilities, I think that it's good to build your own enclosures. And even if you're not building the frame, set up your own bioactive enclosures and kind of really pour yourself into that and try and do the most with the species that you're keeping, and not just like keep accumulating more animals, because anyone, like, you just can't, if you're spread too thin, you just can't give them enough time. And in terms of recognizing illness early, it's so hard because it's not like there are published guidelines for most of these animals about like what is appropriate or inappropriate behavior. So there's always going to be some subjectivity when you're interpreting how animals are doing, because they can't tell us, obviously. But there are actually guides for a lot of domestic species, and it's like, this is what it will look like if an animal is sick. This is what it will look like if they are in pain. And that does not exist for reptiles and amphibians. And I can actually, I've got my iPad here. It's going to be all blurry. Oh, no, it's in focus. So here's like, I don't know if it'll be, just use your imagination, because this looks like you're staring into the sun.
Yeah. You could send me a screenshot of that later, and I'll paste it on the screen for those. But if you just verbally explain, yeah. So
for like dogs and cats, there's a 5-point scale. It's actually out of 4, but it's 0 to 4, and it is like, this is what a cat looks like when it's in pain. This is what a dog looks like when it's in pain. They have that for rats, for like lab animal veterinarians. Like, this is a grimace in a rat. This is a grimace in a dog. There's some subjectivity to interpreting that, obviously, but it is a published scale that at least we have like a shared way to discuss signs that we're seeing. That doesn't really exist for reptiles and amphibians. And you kind of need to know both your species and your animal in particular. And what I would say, what you're probably looking out for is atypical behavior. So if you've had an animal for years and basically this is when it comes out, this is when it doesn't come out, this is what it looks like when it's hungry, this is what it looks like when it's asleep. If you start seeing something that is odd, that potentially is a problem. You don't want to see, like an example with chameleons. Chameleons on the ground is usually not a good sign. But that's not published anywhere. That's just sort of experience and kind of extrapolating what we know from different animals to your pet. So it can be really hard, and that's why I've been a little bit concerned about recent social media trends where people build sometimes really cool enclosures, but then have sort of anecdotal observations where they just decide that what they're seeing means the animal is happier. Like maybe that's true or not. And I'll explain what I mean, but I see a lot of posts on like Instagram where it's like upgraded my snake to an animal, or excuse me, upgraded my snake to an enclosure where we have like top-down heat and UVB light, and now it's basking. It's happy now. And it's like, yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe, but also my snake was trying to bask when he was developing a respiratory infection.
Right.
So if the sign for respiratory infection and normal happy behavior is the same, we can't really say that's a good thing, right? That's like at best like a neutral sign.
Yeah.
So I worry a little bit about that, because with nobody seemingly publishing or recording the behavior of these animals and like what is good and what is bad, it just seems to be like a kind of a free for all in whether or not what we're seeing is something that we want to be seeing in the animal or something that is potentially a problem.
Yeah, and it's such a good point to make too, because we see this movement towards providing more space and larger enclosures, which is great. We want that, but there can be a big sacrifice when it comes to having to maintain a much larger environment, especially if you're talking about especially if you're talking about tropical species that need extra heat, or an arid species or a desert species. It's just it's much more difficult for the keeper to manage a way larger space. And you can maybe, if you're providing that heat bulb and yeah, the snake's basking there all of the time, well, then you might ask yourself, are you providing enough heat thoroughly through the entire enclosure?
Right. And I agree with that. And I would say that, I mean, I pretty ruthlessly make fun of keeping animals in racks just because I don't like them. That's kind of my own bias. But there's a reason that herp keepers have traditionally used racks for animals. And it's because they work. They do. If you look at the way that labs keep animals, which is not, those animals are not pets, right? They're kept for like a research purposes. They'll use rack-like enclosures too. And I would not advocate that people who have an emotional attachment to a companion exotic animal use racks. But the benefit is that they're a small enclosure that is basically the minimum size the animal needs to stay reasonably healthy in captivity, and you can exert really good control over that tiny environment. It's really easy to keep at the appropriate humidity and the appropriate heat. And so what I decided that I was going to do after I had this issue with my bioactive enclosure, once I had moved it to the new location, is
actually, can I pause you for 1 second? Because I want you to go into the new enclosure design, because
sure.
I find that fascinating. But before you do that, can we? I had one of my patrons ask about the original enclosure, like the bioactive, the first bioactive, and so I thought we'd just quickly touch on that before we move on.
Sure.
I think he had mentioned that you actually had some carnivorous plants in there.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how that worked and why you did it?
Sure. So in the original enclosure, one aspect of it that I liked that I intend to try and keep in some capacity in future incarnations, once I move on to kind of, I guess this will be, for my snake, this will be snake enclosure kind of version 4, but it'll be bioactive version 2. I had a Nepenthes pitcher plant, and probably more importantly, little butterworts, which I believe are Pinguicula or something like that is the genus name. And I did that because I was having issues with fungus gnats. Mm-hmm. And I think I got the idea from Bill Strand, who's like the chameleon guru. Butterworts just destroy fungus gnats.
Really?
So yeah. So fungus gnats are those little things that will pop up early on in bioactive enclosures, or if you keep house plants, they get really bad in the spring.
They're the worst.
Yes. And I've done a few things to kill them off. You can kill them off with BT washes, which is like a naturally occurring pesticide that kills off fly species. But There is some debate as to how safe that is for frogs. I think officially it's deemed to be pretty safe, but there's like some weird reports of getting mutations if it's used like around tadpoles. So like the dart frog people are really pretty skeptical of it. I've used it to kill off fungus gnats in isopod cultures without any issue, but just as an experiment, I like drenched a bunch of springtails in it, which was theoretically should not kill the springtails, and it just decimated them. The culture eventually came back, so it did not completely eradicate them. But if you're like reading reports online, it's like some of them peer reviewed. It's like, yeah, really, it probably shouldn't have much of an impact on springtails, so that has yet to be assessed. And it's like, I'll assess it right now. Oh, they all died.
Yeah.
So, so that I probably wouldn't recommend using, particularly on amphibians, but that's one option for fungus gnats. There are little nematode species you can use that I've used in chameleon enclosures, and those destroy fungus gnats. And I've not had any issues with them, but I don't know their impact on cleanup crew species. I don't know if they could have potentially some problem with like small frogs. I think they're probably not an issue with vertebrates, but I don't know that information really exists. So I was never worried about him with the chameleon because he doesn't even go down on the ground. But I'd probably be hesitant if you're keeping like a really sensitive ecosystem to dump in a bunch of those too. But the butterworts, yeah, they're like naturally occurring fly paper. They just, all the flies go on them and they just stick there and they die. And
wow.
it works really well. The Nepenthes, I think, would catch them a lot too. It would probably be a little bit more difficult to quantify how many would get killed by the Nepenthes. Nepenthes are a tropical pitcher plant that's like a vine. And occasionally I would use like my phone or a flashlight to kind of shine behind the pitcher to look in and see if there were a bunch of flies and there'd be a bunch of drowned gnats. But it seemed to work really well. Part of it too is that they get these blooms where a couple of them sneak in probably from outside, and then they all kind of pupate at the same time. Then you have a bunch of them. And so if you can have something in that enclosure, some carnivorous plants that will kill off a bunch of the adult forms when they hatch, that really helps with keeping them under control in the longer term. And having a cycled vivarium helps too. Like if you have springtails and you have isopods and everything has reached some sort of equilibrium, you really shouldn't have too much in the way of issues with fungus gnats. But for setting up enclosures early on, they can be like a big hassle.
Yeah, it's usually the first 1 or 2 months where they just get horrible. And I find like they don't always 100% go away, but they go away to the point where you might see 1 or 2 a week type thing. But when they bloom, it's just like, what the hell is going on? So those are some great tips. I'm glad we went down that tangent because I'm going to try that butterwort plant for sure.
Yeah, and there are a lot of species of them. And what's really cool about butterworts and why I recommend them, I have them in a bunch of enclosures now. Their growth pattern is really interesting. They look like little succulents, but they just look like a little succulent, but they trap these plants. And if you rip off the leaves, they just sort of eject the leaves pretty easily, and they'll just generate a new plant from it. Oh, cool. So you can actually take one and just tear it apart and like throw it into a pot. And if you are patient enough, within a couple months, you'll have like 20 of them. Okay, so they're really easy to propagate.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to try that. Well, tell me about the new enclosure design. So now you've had the system failure there, and then how are you going to get in front of it with this new design?
Yeah, so when I had that initial problem, I got the snake out. I put him into his hospital enclosure. I replaced all the equipment that had failed with new equipment. And I was taking temperatures, and it looked like I could probably make it work in its current spot even. And I was like, well, it's not good enough. I don't trust it. I had a problem with it. It was probably due to the fact that the thermostat failed, like most of all. So theoretically, new thermostat, new heater, it should be fine. But I just did not like that it was very poorly insulated. So I thought, I'll put the Python back in for the spring, summer, and early fall, because California nowadays has basically like 2 seasons, which is like 3, I guess. It's like summer, horrible wildfires, winter.
Yes.
So I was like, okay, once wildfire season starts, I'll pull him out. He'll go back into his little tub enclosure for a month or two. And I'll just be building a new replacement enclosure. So I'm making some really good progress on that now. I've actually put most of the veneer on it today. It's actually, as we're speaking, it is drying out in my shed, and I'm going to go put the last couple pieces on this afternoon. So it is quickly reaching completion. But this version, it's going to be similar total usable space. So the old one was 130 gallons total. This one will be 150 gallons of usable space, but it also has a light compartment. And what will make this one unique, because it's still going to have a ledge for climbing, and I'll put branches in and whatnot. It'll still be bioactive and have plants. But what makes this one really unique is it has an integrated rack tray in it. I bought one of the old school ball python rack trays that is like 33 inches long, 18 inches deep, and 5 inches tall. And I built underneath the false bottom like a ledge. And I can send pictures of this that you can put up on the screen so people can actually see what I'm talking about in case the description is unclear. But you will be able to go to the side of this enclosure and pull out the rack. And in that rack tub is going to be a normal hide box. I'll probably just use paper towels or newspaper on the bottom, and then have his water bowl in there. And then that gets pushed back in. There is a hole from the bioactive area that he can crawl down into that tub, and that's just going to be on my old school heater that's currently on his hospital enclosure. So he will be able to go into the old school enclosure if, for whatever reason, the upper kind of outworld area is not as warm or well controlled as he wants, or if he decides he would like to spend all of his time in the bioactive area, he can do that as well. So I'll have a couple more hides available up top. So what makes it unique is it's going to be a hybrid enclosure where I'm trying to kind of blend the best of old school husbandry with kind of new school husbandry in a way where I don't necessarily need to tell him which one is better. He can kind of choose for himself.
Yeah. Well, that's what's so great about it is A, you give the animal choice, and B, you have this entire underground cavern that I'm sure he'll spend a lot of time in there. It's nice and warm, it's secure and dark, but then you have this whole other world where he can go up and explore. And as you know, he already thrives in that environment just from getting him to eat consistently in there. So I think I'm hoping that will spark other people to create something similar, because I think that sometimes happens when we create enclosure, like we already talked about. It's too big, or it's too big to manage for the keeper, and the animal gets sick, or the animal's not thriving, or it's the other side where it's like, I'm just going to keep them in tubs. Well, why can't we do both? It makes sense,
right? And I think so. I think this will work well. I'm excited to see. Not that an N of 1 means much, but I'm excited to see whether he spends most of his time in the tub or comes out, and I'm interested to see whether he'll actually be basking ever, because I am going to use UVB with it. Right now, there's not a ton of evidence. I think there's not any evidence actually that ball pythons truly benefit from UVB light. There's discussion about whether or not they do better with access to full spectrum lighting because it helps them see better, but they're primarily a nocturnal species, not completely, but my understanding at this time is that there's evidence that like colubrid snakes, or kind of the less primitive snakes, so to speak, do benefit from UVB, but the older, I think they used to be called the Henophidians, but I think that's a fake taxon now. Anyway, I digress. If you flip through like Mader's reptile medicine and surgery, the basic line from that book is like, in general, all reptiles should have UVB. And then it's kind of like, but, people keep leopard geckos without UVB and they seem like they do fine. And the new Caledonian geckos seem like they do fine. And there's corn snakes seem like they benefit from it, but ball pythons don't. So it still hasn't been studied all that well. And I have a bunch of these old UVB tubes because I use them for my chameleon, and the chameleon needs pretty high UVB, and then they die a little bit, and I test it with my meter, and I go, well, okay, and I swap it out. So I have like a closet full of these old tubes that they're too dim for the chameleon, but they'd probably be great for the python. So I'm going to get another fixture and start using UVB on there. I'll have a top-down white, and then I'll have the heater underneath the tub. And I'm curious to see if we see basking in that environment, or if he's just going to be like, nope, I'm going to sit in the tub.
Yeah. Well, I'll be really curious as well. I had a similar in the enclosure right over my shoulder for my carpet python. He has a heat mat on the bottom in a hide, and it's not on all the time. It comes on just as sort of, it's on during the night and into the early morning, and it goes off during the day. And then he has a halogen and UV and visible light at the top. And when I first put him in there, it took him a long time to start basking. And then eventually now he uses both pretty frequently. Yeah. And I find that he uses the halogen pretty much immediately after he eats. Like once he eats, he goes under the halogen for a long time. And then, as he's digesting, he'll spend a lot more time underground. So I'll be curious to see if you notice something like that as well with the ball python.
And our carpet pythons, how are they? Pretty much nocturnal, or are they both?
Yeah, pretty much nocturnal. I mean, if you talk to anybody who's looking for them active, they're going to find them active at nighttime. But I mean, who knows where they're during the day? Are they sleeping in trees and having exposure? Yeah,
because I saw one at the National Aquarium. I was in Baltimore last weekend, and it was in this huge enclosure, but it was just it was like hanging out on a log under a basking light. So it was hanging out during the day.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be interesting. I think that it'll work out pretty well. I do have some ideas now, having mostly built the enclosure, how I would probably have done it differently if I was starting over again, as always happens. Because I'm essentially building like prototypes that are also the only one that will ever be built.
Yeah.
Which is if you were designing a product, right, you would build the prototype and then you would redesign it, and then you'd look at that and then you'd redesign it again. Like I have the tub coming out from the side because I just really wanted it to come out from the side so that I could have plants growing in the front and the back, because it kind of eats up space by having this ledge built up in the middle of the enclosure to accommodate the tub.
Right.
And I was really stubbornly like, I don't want this to come out the front. I don't want to have I don't want to have a drawer that you have to like pull down, or a flip lid or something and then pull it out. I want it to come out the side so you can't see it. And as I was building it, I was like, that was a stupid thing to prioritize. Now I have this giant enclosure. It's going to look great. I'm going to have it forever, and it can never be put somewhere where there's anything on either side of it. It's going to need 3 full feet on the side that it pulls out. So it'll be fine. The place I'm going to keep it in my house is kind of by the door to the room. So there's not going to be anything obstructing access to the rack anyway. But I think that what I will probably do once I have this all made, and I'm filming most of the making process, like I will show how I made it, and I'm probably going to have some tips for if anybody wants to make a similar project, how to do it more effectively than I did. Because I'm also making it I want it to be made out of redwood because I like redwood, but I also like lumber has been really expensive and I didn't want to spend the money on like really nice redwood boards. So I've been like basically making my own common boards by taking sections of redwood fence and like sanding them down. And that was just like a giant crazy time suck. That was not a smart idea at all.
Processing your own lumber.
Yeah, literally. So if you were to just do this in a way where you were sanding it, like you were to make the enclosure, you sand it down so it's got a decent finish, and then you just like paint it black, I think that would be really reasonable to do for most people with access to some basic power tools.
Yeah.
Doing what I'm doing is like a weird nightmare that I probably wouldn't recommend. But if you just like dialed it in a little bit, I think it could be really attainable.
And how far do you think you are to having the animal in there?
He probably won't go, like realistically, he's probably not going to go in there until like January.
Yeah.
Just because, or maybe even February, because right now where I am is the frame is done and waterproofed, and I'm putting on like a veneer because I used OSB, which is like the terrible looking plywood because lumber prices, at least in the States, have been so high due to like COVID supply shortages. I should not have done that in hindsight. Lumber has actually come down in cost during the course of this project. So I've actually ended up spending more trying to like cover up the fact it's OSB than I would have if I just bought decent looking plywood to begin with. But I'm putting on the veneer. That'll be done today. Then I need to make my vents, and I have like 2 potential ways that I'll do the vents, which is going to depend on how much I screw up my veneer drilling the holes for the vents. So if I totally scuff it up, then there's going to be like a redwood frame around it to cover that up. And if I don't, I can probably just be done with that potentially even today. So that'll be done. Then I need to put the polyurethane coating on it. That'll take probably a week to totally get done. And then I'll be ready to set it up. But once I set it up, I usually let the plants grow in for about a month before I put the animal into it. And I also want to make sure that the temperatures are like stable. So I need to keep a close eye on it, make sure that nothing weird is happening prior to introduction, and then he'll go in once everything seems normal.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely be looking forward to that. That makes sense. It's good to let it grow in, and I mean, we're already halfway through December, so it takes some time to get it all set up. But no, I'm really looking forward to seeing how he behaves in there and just how he interacts with it, and I think the final product will be great. And I think I would love to see more people experimenting with similar ideas to give the animals both worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it'll work really well. And I have a similar plan for my leopard gecko. The next incarnation of the arid environment is going to be, instead of a Tupperware disguised thing that I bury in the sand, I'm going to have a whole front underground area so that you can look in and see her. Now, it won't be a great hide if you can look in and see it. So I'm going to have, I haven't totally figured out what it's going to be, but there's going to be a removable cover on it. So most of the time it's totally dark, but I can get in there if I need to, because right now, if I need to get at her when she's underground, I basically have to dig up the whole thing, which is not a very good design.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. I'll be watching out for that one as well. Well, Dr. Long, we've had a great conversation, and you're so thorough with all the answers, and I know there's tons of great information in here. I think we've pretty much covered everything we want to today. Is there anything that we left out that you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess my advice to everybody, and what I hope to see more of, is more DIY projects. I think that everybody talks on social media about like, oh, what's the most important thing you could buy? And I always see that, and it's it's a saw. Go get a saw and some plywood, and you can make your own enclosure. I think that one of my goals for the coming year is going to be, I'm going to try and design a vivarium that can be made without power tools, and try and keep it probably under $100, maybe 200. I'm going to try and figure out how to design an exoterra size enclosure, like the ones that people use for crested geckos. I'm going to see if I can make one of those for half the price of the exoterra without using any power tools, because I think that would be a very useful set of plans for people in the hobby if they could make their own setup like that. Yeah,
that would be amazing. And it gives people more freedom and more power as well. If you're able to build those things, then you have a lot more control over the hobby. Yeah, that's great. And I assume that will be all documented on the YouTube channel and whatnot.
Yeah, that's the plan.
Can you let everybody know where they can find you online? YouTube channel, Instagram, whatnot?
Oh yeah. I mean, I am a terrible YouTuber and social media person in that I don't post for long stretches of time. So my Instagram is Connorology. That is, I guess, the study of me, which I didn't really think of when I made that, but now I'm stuck with it. So that's that. So Connorology on Instagram. I tend to be pretty responsive on Instagram. And then my YouTube, I assume Dylan will link in some form or another. It's just, right now anyway, it's just Connor Long. So I've never actually tried to search myself. I don't know if there are a number of other Connor Longs that come up, but
it comes up right away.
It's Connor Long. Okay, it comes up right away. Dylan knows how to find me better than I do, which is why most of my followers are probably various accounts that my mom has made.
No, you have some great content on there, so I'll make sure everything's in the show notes. People can find it. And as the caveat that I always mention when we have a vet on is please don't message Connor for medical advice or vet advice. But I'm sure if you have questions about DIY or things like that, you're probably happy to, or even Arid stuff and bioactive setups. I'm sure you're happy to answer those questions.
Yeah, and I get a fair amount of questions I'm usually pretty good at responding to.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Long. I had a blast chatting with you. We covered so much here today, and I know this will be very valuable to listeners, so thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Hopefully it can be edited into a coherent format where I'm not just rambling like a crazy person.
No, there's no need. It's perfect the way it was. All right, that is the end of that episode. Dr. Long, thank you so much for joining me and spending all that time with me to record the podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I know there's a lot more information in your head, so I think we'll definitely have you back on so we can have a different discussion, talk about different things, because we could definitely have continued on for another couple of hours. So again, thank you so much. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, sharing it is one of the easiest ways you can show your appreciation. You can also find more information on Animals at Home network.com. You can find us on Patreon as well at patreon.com/animalsathome. And if you are interested in any new reptile related equipment, make sure you head to customreptilehabitats.com. They are the sponsor of this episode. And if you head to one of the links that's in the YouTube description or the show notes, a small commission will come back to me at no extra cost to you if you do end up making a purchase. All right, that is the end of that for this week. I will catch everybody next Sunday. Thank you.